Good morning, welcome to the Point. This morning, we take a look back at a week in Lansing that produced some movement toward restoring cuts made to the budget by Governor Whitmer in late September. We're joined by two appropriators, beginning with Republican Representative Mark Huizenga from Walker. Representative, let's talk about this past week and how some restoration of cuts that were made after the legislature sent the budget to the governor, and they came about this past week quicker than I might have expected, maybe quicker than you expected. Tell me what happened.
Well, as you know, the governor vetoed 147 line items. I hold office hours 5 times a month, all throughout the community and in the district, and really heard very loudly from my constituents on what was most important to them. We talk about things like the West Michigan Partnership for Children, foster care program, the tuition grant waiver program, and the charter schools, for instance. And all those are going to cross party lines. It's unfortunate the governor made those decisions to veto those line items, but we had to make sure that we had the right answer, the right solution for it. We talked a little bit earlier that I didn't actually think it was going to happen until next week, and I was pleasantly surprised that we could see restoration of those vetoes quicker. And I think that we really came to great consensus. It sounds like there's a little bit more to happen. You heard there's a shell bill that's out there. We don't know exactly what that's going to contain yet, but we're moving towards a resolution, and I'm just grateful for the fact that we were able to come to a resolution and to see these draconian cuts repaired.
In round figures, the governor cut about $1 billion with line item vetoes, moved around several $100,000 more in the administrative board, but the restoration was about half of that, $495 million, which also includes things like rural hospital funding, secondary road patrol, some of the things we'd heard a lot about. So this happened in a bipartisan way. You were able to bring the two parties together. Was there a particular moment? Was there a watershed event, or was it just a matter of time and timing as you come to the end of the not the fiscal year, but the end of the calendar year?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of pressure on all of us to come to a resolution, but I think that what really got it was the fact that the Senate and the House were in agreement with the governor, and that's really what we were all holding on. I think that both the Senate and the House were very eager and prepared. Many of the legislators, myself included, were very concerned about some programs, especially like the foster care. Let's make sure that we don't cause harm. I mean, that's our job to provide resources for those most vulnerable. And when we did that, the restoration, I think that's really going to help a lot. And I think when we look at what we're trying to do here is to ensure that we have responsible budgets in the future as well. And that's probably the most important thing that I see from it. It took a little bit of time. Look, it's very difficult to sit across the table from somebody when they tell you that if we don't see restoration in the next 5 days, that we may have to move towards layoffs. We were able to mitigate some of those things, but those were really the looming crises that were on the near future for us.
What was the change for the governor if most of this spending had been approved by the legislature in the first place? And she line item vetoed things, and quite clearly she was not happy about the way the budget came together, and she was not involved in the process, particularly in the final weeks. All of that aside, what changed that is going to allow her to sign similar spending bills that are going back to her now?
I can't speak for the governor, of course, but I'm assuming that she figures she made a mistake. The vetoes cut across party lines. They hit everybody. They hit every corner of our state. And to see them hit not just Republican lines, and even when I sat down with the budget process early on and talked with my minority vice chair, Terry Sabo, about what was important to him, we had ideas, we worked together, we worked across the aisle, and when you look at the way the budgets were passed, many of these budgets were passed in very strong bipartisan fashion. So it really wasn't a Republican or Democrat thing. It was the governor who chose to say, I think that I'm upset about the fact that you didn't want to pass the gas tax. And realistically, we can't appropriate or spend money that's not been in the budget on the income side. So if no one passes a bill that says we're going to bring in new revenue, we can't spend that money. So that's just how it works.
Not only did nobody pass it, nobody introduced it. That is still an open question. And road funding is interesting in this budget because depending on how this all shakes out, there is still more money in the pipeline, but maybe not as much as there would have been. In the final minute or so that we have left, quickly talk to me about what's not funded still.
Yeah, so in my budget, there's a couple big items. The Going Pro Fund. Going Pro provides resources for businesses to get increased skills for their employees. In fact, I was at the Rockford Chamber of Commerce just last week, and a resident asked about that program. She said that when she applied, they said there wasn't funding right now. So we know this impacts businesses, and this isn't a handout. This is government working to help get people new skills, upskill those that have greater needs. It's good for our economy, and it's good for our community. I'm hopeful that that will come back, not this year, but probably in January. We also know Pure Michigan in my budget was not included. Like that program or not, it was in our budget. It was passed bipartisanly, and it's my hope to see that at least some level of restoration would occur there as well.
Is there still more negotiation to be this next week, which I think will be the final week, or will this pretty much wrap up and anything additional will have to come in January?
My sense is that this will probably wrap up the budget supplemental process for this year. I believe that there are a number of other items that are going to come back in January. We'll continue to work hard. It doesn't do any good to have hardworking taxpayer dollars sit on the balance sheet. We need to get those dollars working for the people.
From the Democratic side of the appropriations equation, Grand Rapids Representative Rachel Hood. Representative, this past week, you and other appropriators got together and started churning out some supplemental spending bills to make up for some of the budget cuts that were done earlier. The governor and the legislature did not negotiate together. So when she got the budget, there were things that she was concerned about, even though they may have been priorities. Mm-hmm. So she made a bunch of line item spending cuts, moved some other money around, and now here we are, a couple of months later, making these changes. It all happened from an observer standpoint pretty quickly, but I guess all of this conversation has been happening for a while.
Yeah, so we did take a pretty significant break for the hunting season and the Thanksgiving holiday. That was about 3 weeks, and during which quiet conversations were happening with the quadrant and the governor's administration. I would assume all throughout, with just a couple of moments rest around the holiday. So what was brought to the table at appropriations on Wednesday, I believe, was about $300 million in the line item vetoes and in addressing some of the administrative board issues as well. Those were approved. We have some more administrative board changes to address and adjust next week, to my understanding. And there are still some significant items that are left on the veto plate, and we anticipate that we'll have another supplemental at the top of the year.
When you talk about the administrative board, just to explain, because this is a pretty rare occasion.
Sure.
Last governor to use it in this significant manner was John Engler, and it is a board that is set up to do just that, allow the governor to switch money within a budget to different items. And that's kind of to offer flexibility so you don't have to go back to the legislature for everything. In this case, she used it in a broader form, perfectly legal, perfectly acceptable, but a broader form than we normally see. And so now they're making some adjustments there. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that, other than to say that what you as appropriators and later as full bodies did is you restored some of those cuts for things like rural hospitals, things like that secondary road patrol that we kind of heard a lot about at the very beginning, because some of the counties were pretty concerned about having some of that coverage, as well as some tuition help and charter school help, a number of different things. Yeah. But it's not everything, as you point out.
That's right. The items that were on the table this week were significant, and I'll back up to say that the administrative board powers were used to address functional deficits. Major, if the budget has infrastructure, these were infrastructure issues that needed to be addressed, core issues, so that we could continue to operate. So it wasn't a tool that was used lightly, although I've heard it characterized as such. It was used in order as a stopgap to address some potential emergencies in government services that were key and critical to the health and protection of the people of Michigan. So it's not a preferred tool. Nobody would want to get there, et cetera. Some of the items, it's the holiday season, so we've been talking about this in terms of the holiday table. we now have the turkey on the table. We now have some of the key items that we'll call the side dishes. The vitamins and minerals are surrounding the protein. And over the coming weeks, we'll negotiate what we're going to have for dessert in this last supplemental.
Some of those dessert items are items that people are familiar with. Pure Michigan, Going Pro, which is
Talent Fund.
Yeah, kind of a training fund. One of the things that we've heard a lot about in Michigan for the past number of years is trying to train more talent, get them more quickly into the workforce, because we do have these growing jobs. So all of those things are, and they certainly aren't unanimous, but they are things that do have constituency within the legislature. And you believe those are things that will happen, at least they will be addressed after the first of the year.
I do. I don't see a circumstance where we don't invest in Pure Michigan or continue to make investments in talent and getting ready for the 21st century economy and the kind of jobs that we need to retain and attract in Michigan. Those are things that we haven't left on the table or ignored for decades, and because they are so critical in terms of supporting our ability to be economically successful. Tourism is one of our top industries. I think it's just a matter of getting the work done and moving steadily toward the goal of finishing 100% of the budget.
Completely unfair, got less than a half minute left. Your first year, describe it in a few words.
Fascinating. It's been an exciting year. I've had a great opportunity to witness what it's like to have a transition in government, to watch the House and the Senate leadership adjust to a Democratic administration. I'm really incredibly proud of our administration and what they've been able to do in this first year. Incredibly proud of what I've been able to do even as a member of the minority.
When we come back, a counterpoint to a segment we ran last week on doing away with term limits. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Last week, we told you about a lawsuit that would challenge term limits in Michigan. This week, a longtime supporter of term limits explains why he thinks that's a bad idea. I want to talk a little bit about term limits, but first let's make a delineation. You are with a national group, but you're also part of, talk and speak for, a group of kind of loosely organized, not formally organized group here in Michigan that's been around for about 3 decades. So talk to me first of all about your official position.
So my official position is with a group called U.S. Term Limits, and we advocate for term limits at all levels of government. Right now we're working on a big push to term limit Congress, and we have been for several years. The local group that I'm with is a group called Don't Touch Term Limits. It's a Michigan-based group, and it came from the group of people who originally got together and implemented term limits in Michigan. We gathered signatures back in 92 and passed it in 92. I was in high school, helped a little bit with the signatures at that point. I wasn't old enough to vote, but I was very interested in the issue. And then I kind of been involved ever since, and I've been a big advocate of term limits for a lot of years, and that has kind of turned into, you get pulled into different things, and eventually I got pulled into employment, and now I manage the field operations.
Well, let's talk about, if we have time, we'll talk about the national initiative, but I'm interested in what's going on in Michigan, because recently a lawsuit was filed on behalf of 8, and I think that number will grow, former legislators who say because of term limits, they and they alone are a handful of people who can't run for office. Before we get to that, you were also doing events, not necessarily in response to that, but there'd also been some discussion legislatively about trying to change term limits, which, by the way, I think would be a heavy lift because it would take a supermajority, but we can talk about that. But tell me why term limits, from your perspective, is a good thing.
Term limits is a good thing because it keeps legislators closer to citizens than they would otherwise be. Now, back before we had term limits, a lot of people thought it would be a panacea for everything good under the sun that you could possibly want. And we know that it hasn't been a panacea that, did everything great. But it has done a lot of good things. We have the most contested elections in the country in Michigan because term limits mean regularly open seats. Even when seats aren't open because of term limits, people go in and challenge because the incumbent does not have the established advantage that they had otherwise. We know that lobbyists despise and hate term limits. They like to claim that it puts them in charge, but they've never given us money. Every time term limits are up for a vote anywhere, they're always on the opposite side. They're always spending, 5, 6, 10 to 1 against the people who are in favor of term limits, trying to keep term limits from going. And it's easy to understand why. Term limits breaks up legislator-lobbyist relationships, and that makes their job harder. They don't want to have to buy a new person every 6 years. It makes what they do very, very hard. Recent study has shown that one in Portugal and one in the United States showed that term limits increases voter turnout. So that's a benefit of term limits. One thing that we're just getting into looking at now, but seems to hold true, is that the longer a person is in office, the more times they run, the less of their donations come from the district. A lot of times when people run the first time, they put in a big chunk of their own money. They get a lot of friends and family money. Their mom writes them a check, their grandma writes them a check, their friends, their family, the people they know in the community write them a check. But then once the seat is decided, either at the primary or other stuff, you'll see a lot of big PAC, special interest, lobbyist money start coming in, these big $5,000, $10,000 donations. And when a person runs for office the second time, I've only seen a couple where they put any of their own money in. They still get a few donations from, your grandma still writes you a check, and your friends and whatnot still write you a check. But by the time they're running but mostly it's PAC and special interest and lobbyist donations. And by the time they run for a third time or a fourth time, it's almost all big money that's coming, maybe some randomly in the district, but for the most part outside of their districts, trying to keep them in power because that person, now they've got a relationship built and they don't want to have to build a relationship with somebody else. So those are the 3 quick benefits of term limits. Other things we know is that it gets people out to the door. Legislators are knocking doors the first time they run. They knock a ton of doors, and that gets the citizens more engaged. I mean, that ties kind of to the voter turnout, but really you got legislators out there talking to people at the door about the issues. And the guys that have been there for a lot of years, they don't knock doors like the guys that are coming, men and women who are coming in the first time. It makes a big difference in how much engagement.
Well, let me clarify something, because you talked about the third or the fourth time, and I'm talking specifically now about here in Michigan, about
right.
the state term limits, because they can only run for 3 terms in the House and 2 terms in the Senate. So, I mean,
the best way to look at it here in Michigan is you got the first time they run for the House, most of the time it's their own money and they go do some fundraising. They can run for the House 2 more times, and then most of them try to run for a Senate spot. And that's when the first time they run for Senate, you get back a little bit to some in district donations, but I consider that like the 4th time when they're running again to go for the Senate or something else like that.
You said 2 different things. You said lobbyists didn't want to create a relationship with a new member, but you also said they didn't want to buy a new member. Is that what you mean?
Lobbying costs money. They've got to pay lobbyist staff to go out and talk to legislators, educate legislators on issues. That costs them and their clients money to build and buy that relationship. So I don't know that I would say, I'm not saying that they are handing over money and buying people, but they're certainly paying a person to go out and build relationships. They're down there paying for Capitol Days where they provide meals to all the legislators and try to build relationships. There's certainly a lot of money being spent on lobbying, and term limits makes it so that it's more expensive for them. Rather than just going in and kind of, having the relationships built up, they've actually got to go out and continue to work for and establish them. So in that way, they do have to spend a lot of money and purchase those relationships.
I'm going to ask you the other side of this question,
Yeah.
but let me ask it this way first. Term limits has brought a lot of new blood into the legislature. As you see those new people coming in, and I see the fresh faces all the time with a lot of excitement, can you point to some real successes based on that new blood coming in? Because we've seen a lot of really bright people come in and out of the system over that period of time, last 25 years, since people have been term limited.
Well, certainly we can. We can look at a lot of different things that there's kind of an institutional inertia where if you're a legislator and you go out and push for a certain policy proposal and it passes, and then let's say that it turns out 5 years down the road that it was a bad policy proposal and the effects were not good, you have so much buy-in into that from when you had really pushed and established and networked and did everything you did to get it passed, that you have this inertia against pushing back against that and passing that. I think the best example we have here in Michigan is the single business tax. It was a value-added tax that passed in Michigan in 1975. The last legislators who were in 1975 to leave the Michigan legislature finally left because of term limits, but they didn't leave until 2002 and 2004. And we didn't get the single business tax repealed until 2006. After all those guys had, all those legislators had left, there's this inertia that sticks with it. Now we know Michigan, a manufacturing state, to have a value-added tax is very, very hard on manufacturing because on the cost of equipment, cost of the things that you're producing and whatnot. Yet it was allowed to continue for 30 years while it drove the economy of Michigan into the ground. Now, after the single business tax, we passed another tax that a lot of people didn't like, they didn't care for, called the Michigan business tax. And it did not take long before legislators were willing to say, 4 years. I mean, there's a lot of House turnover in 4 years before legislators were willing to say, this obviously isn't working, this isn't doing what we intended, we need to get back in there and change it. Having term limits allows those new faces to come in and say, let's look at these things and actually see what kind of changes they're making. And they're not wedded to it. They don't have all this long-term capital built up in an idea that if it's proven to be false, they're going to push back against it just because.
It should be pointed out you had two different administrations and a different control
Yes.
of the legislature, so that also played into it, but I don't deny that.
Because of term limits, we had different administrations.
So then let me ask you the other question. You talk about the institutional pressure. What about the institutional memory? I mean, when I first went into the legislature to cover, I could go seek out different members who could tell you chapter and verse about why this particular piece of legislation passed, why they thought it was good, why they know other people think it was bad, what the nexus of all that was, what the thought process was, why they were there till 2 o'clock in the morning. You go in today and people's, at best, they've been there for 12 years at the middle of their
last Senate term.
Next to the last term in the Senate, or their last term in the Senate. So is there a loss from institutional memory?
Well, we can look and see. Did Michigan fall off some cliff? Are we passing and doing crazy things that they haven't done in other states? Are we somehow at the bottom of the pack? And we're not. Michigan, we have problems with roads. So does Illinois, so does Wisconsin, so does New York, so do all these other states. I mean, it's a cold weather seasonal problem. You're going to have problems with roads. And there's always a budget battle. We have budget battles. Well, there's always budget battles anywhere where you have a divided executive branch and legislative branch. There's always a budget battle, which normally leads to a crisis where they're talking about extending session and everything. So these aren't problems unique to term limit states. Do we lose institutional knowledge? Well, we're talking about that institutional inertia just a minute ago. There's a lot of vested, I was part of this idea and I don't want to see it changed. That inertia does not want to see things changed. But what we get with term limits is we get people who are out there living under the laws as not legislators, not everybody coming and telling them how great everything that they are doing is, really buttering them up and laughing at all their bad jokes, everything like that. We get a lot of people who are out there, they're business owners, they're teachers, they're people who work in the community who can then run and get it, and they know the problems that we're facing today. I mean, we had a law in Michigan for decades that you had to price each item individually. I mean, it took forever to get that passed. Michigan is on the front edge of pension reform. There's pension reforms or pension projects all over the state or public pension systems that are just terribly, terribly underfunded. Well, we got ahead of that back in the 90s. We're getting ahead of these problems. Term limits is not a panacea, but it brings a lot more people with a lot of real-world experience into it. If we wanted somebody who was really good and really super professional, I mean, that's an argument for a political aristocracy. I mean, we could have a king, a guy who's been raised his whole life and trained in all matters of state and whatnot. It'd probably be great at ministering and ruling, but we're a nation that wants to be led in a Republican form of government by citizens. And we want people who out there have real world experience, not people who are professional politicians.
We'll have a final note when we come back to the point. The race for the White House is gearing up, and in very real terms, Michigan is right in the middle of the fray. While Democrats are focusing on early primary and caucus states, the Republican ticket has targeted Michigan, a state that went for the GOP in 2016 for the first time in nearly 30 years. Vice President Mike Pence was in West Michigan this past week. President Trump will be in Battle Creek in less than 2 weeks. We're just less than 11 months from Election Day, and already the race is on. We'll cover it all every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To The Point.